Is everything that you say?
Yes, exactly.
Being
So they've I like this. Actually, for the Hodgkinson book, yeah, extraordinary. They kept things very well.
So is that for the makers?
Both quite well, because they worked with Patrick on the, the proposed editions and things that were going to, there's an eye catcher. Patrick obviously gave them quite a lot of stuff from the early days, so there's the collection of Richard Dines photographs,
So is that all coming away?
Yeah, no, it's not. I always think it's not far away, but it's a pretty mammoth undertaking. As you know, these things take a long time.
Yeah, but you've got everything you need from me.
Yeah, oh yes. No, I've got draft layouts. I'll put around to you at some point or send to you.
So we do that.
But I think I've done the layouts for like, but if you're back in action as well.
Yeah, no, I am.
Not that I knew you were around back.
I can see now as well.
No, poor you.
The worst thing about it was that you have to do a design and you can't get the original text. Hi there. Where are you going?
Well, I left my jacket.
Are you?
Yeah, good.
Not yet. Yeah, when they close the building, but we're not kicked out. So. What time it is, right? Because I'm leaving before. I'm not leaving before they leave. So they find a new home, they get everything out of them, pull the books out of the boxes, and then I can come back.
And what's that?
I'm actually recruiting right now, so it's on the way and the team's quite huge now. They're doing very well together with Brown family now. They built a relationship where the two, Aaron and Zoe, and their son and Yuri, they were very well. It was a bit rocky at the beginning, I feel. Built a nice relationship with them. They come with their I think Janet's in the Manchester.
Good evening, everybody. So, welcome to Dialogues 27. We're going to get to 30 this year. And we are very grateful to William Mann to come and speak about Hans Döllgast. the project I know is the Pinatek in Munich, and I think William's going to talk about that and and as he's just, you may well all know that this is a kind of preview to a talk that he's going to give at the AF in a couple of weeks, and it's also the culmination of 2.5 years worth of work, and it's effectively an extended version of what he's going to write, what he's written for the book. So it's a substantial piece of research on a hugely important post-war German architect who, the paper I previously read and reread, although not got to the end of recently, was the paper in the 9H book from about 1995, which is an extraordinary tale of, as much as anything, negotiation as well as skill and care of the architect. William is a partner, director with Watson Mann. I'm sure you all know their extraordinary work, and of course in a way the parallels between Döllgast and their work. On the starting in 2013, Nasty Castle. So, William, thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to share this work in progress. Hopefully not for much longer. So, as Simon said, my talk's based on a draft of an essay I've written. I ran out of time to edit, so it's a bit long, about 1 hour and 15. Apologies to those who are standing. My essay is an afterword for Max Sternberg's monograph on Döllgast, which will be published by Lond Humphreys later next year. Max's work is a fascinating interpretation of a very wide cross-section of Döllgast's work, considering his houses and churches, his work of post-war reconstruction, for which he's best known, his urbanism, and his quite extensive writings. Astonishingly, this will be the first comprehensive monograph on Döllgast in English or German. My focus is on fewer projects, with, I suppose, the challenge, implicit challenge, to reflect from the present, from contemporary practice. An interesting present, disoriented, facing crises of overconsumption and underproduction. Overconsumption of hydrocarbons, underproduction of affordable housing, in which the cycles and stutters of the economy seem to gum up us doing anything about the changes we need to make. So, in this context, the middle years of the last century, or early and middle years of trench warfare, pandemic, inflation and depression, economic depression, nationalist populism, total war, reconstruction, feel intimately close, uncomfortably so. The career of Hans Döllgast straddled this period of persistent and deepening crisis in Germany. For this reason alone, his work is of historical interest and curiosity. But the qualities of his buildings invite serious reflection. Qualities achieved in spite of very difficult circumstances from which they emerged. I'll talk about Döllgast's work through 4 built projects and 4 clusters of unbuilt projects. Tony, your head is just appearing on the corner. And I'll address 2 aspects in particular. Firstly, the split personality of his work, which I find strangely compelling. Split between the intense realism and absolute economy of means in his buildings and the extravagant gestures of his unbuilt projects. On the one hand, shaped by and responding to the hardest of hard times, on the other, reacting imaginatively to disoriented times. Secondly, the distinctive combination of rigour and openness in his buildings, this dynamic relation between detail and room, between building and city, between part and whole, which despite the distilled simplicity of his language, shows no interest in systematisation or modularisation. So not fully sharing his contemporaries' growing interest in industrialised construction, and perhaps for this reason resonating with our post-industrial age, in particular our interest in adaptation. The variety in Döllgast's work flows from the stops and starts of a tumultuous period in Germany. He was born in 1891, from which flowed a series of instances of bad timing. Graduating from the TH in Munich in 1914, enlisting for military service. 20 of his year signed up, 3 returned. He set up a practice in 1927, but as the practice was getting going, the 1929 financial crisis hit construction. An interesting opportunity came up in 1940, when he was offered a post as city architect of Thorn. But there were no good choices in 1940. It was in occupied Poland. A brief flurry of post-war reconstruction work started after the foundation of the Federal Republic in 1949, when he was already 58. But on his retirement from professorship at the TH in 1956, the opportunities for significant public commissions tailed off. He continued at a high level but small scale until his death in 1974. So these two periods in red-brown, in a career of 50 years, not counting the lost years of the First World War, there were just 2 periods in which his mature skills matched the burning issues of the day. The housing question in 1928-29 and the reconstruction of war-ravaged Munich in 1949 to 56. So when necessity pressed or called, he was prepared. The question of bad timing is illustrated by the trajectories of a number of former assistants in Peter Behrens' studio, whose paths crossed at the Werkbund's Weissnapf exhibition 1927. Walter Gropius, 8 years older than Döllgast, Mies, 5 years older, Korb, 3 years older, and Alexander Popp, the same age. As project architect for Behrens' apartment block, Döllgast saw close up the case made by Gropius, Mies and Korb for the industrialisation of housing production, but showed little interest, like Behrens, in following this path. Beside his former assistant's explorations of steel frames and of prefabrication, Behrens' apartment block in load-bearing masonry appeared conservative. Yet, as his essay on economical building makes clear, Behrens' position was carefully considered, weighing the constraints of urban land value, contracting capacity, prioritising the construction of collective housing at medium density rather than prefabricated low-rise housing, in order to make sites close to the city centre viable and to sustain collective facilities and public transport links. This was the approach that Behrens developed and applied in the 1920s, building housing at scale in Vienna and Berlin, with Döllgast heavily involved in these projects. Munich's large-scale housing programme started relatively late in 1928. This time lag and the cautious assumptions underlying the programme played to Döllgast's experience in Behrens' studio. Döllgast's urban plan for 1,800 apartments at Neuhausen in the northwest of the city, in between 2 linear infrastructures, the Nymphenburg Canal and the railway line, distinctively combines openness and schematic repetition at the centre with enclosure and adjustment at its irregular edges. Döllgast fused the robust simplicity of Behrens' apartment buildings with a Zeilenbau, evenly spaced linear blocks interspersed with gardens, as pioneered by his former tutor, Theodor Fischer, artfully combining rationalist layouts with the shaping of open spaces in the city building tradition. The comparisons here to Fischer's Alte Heide in Munich, generally considered the first Zeilenbau project, to Gropius' Dammerstock in Karlsruhe, and to Döllgast's collaboration with Michael Kurtz and Buchenau and Augsburg, show this engaging tension between repetition and irregularity at Neuhausen. At its eastern and western ends, deeper perimeter blocks face and define urban squares. A 370-metre long block lines the north side of the central east-west street. The majority of apartments are provided in simple linear blocks alternating with shared gardens. These are oriented north-south, and therefore the apartments have east and west aspects. Each street serves one side only. The dimensions are carefully judged, with the gardens separating the 4-storey blocks deep enough to have a distinct landscape quality, now filled with mature trees. single-storey shops and studios interweave with the larger scale blocks to give enclosure and definition to collective spaces. Irregularities of the site are accommodated through localised variations that enrich the whole, such as the triangular garden and the small courtyard of artist studios that backs onto it. Through this interplay of the built and the unbuilt, deploying a limited number of elements within a specific set of constraints, Döllgast builds a conception of the city that is not a systematic assembly of objects, but a language of interconnected parts of spaces and buildings cohering to form ever greater wholes. The city of Munich had actually built 12,000 dwellings in the preceding 3-year period on scattered sites throughout the city. This new programme of 12,000 dwellings in 3 years were on large sites at the periphery, and they were looking for a distinct identity, to communicate a sense of the city government as a social and economic actor, not just a facilitator. The mayor therefore argued that the estates should not be made up of individual buildings, but should appear as a single distinct block. Döllgast's design answers this unusual call quite precisely. The commonplace materials, rough cast rendered masonry, wood frame windows, deep projecting eaves, and the variations of layout and detailing resulting from the involvement of a dozen architects give this utilitarian whole an unsentimental softness, modulated in the scale of both buildings and open spaces, legible both as a single superblock and a multiplicity of interior spaces. Neuhausen synthesises scales, characteristics, and time signatures. So it responds to the urbanised village. Neuhausen was a village on the city edge, the city that extends and the metropolis that it helps to form. With no semblance of contrivance, it shifts from the edge of metropolitan monotony to a distinctively intimate scale. As with Döllgast's later buildings, the layout is rhythmically repetitive, both of elements and details. Economy of means underpins the conception, but is not amplified or paraded. Rather, it's customised by handwork, tuned to the place and complemented by supple adjustments and at encounters with the existing. In the economic aftershocks from the Wall Street crash of October 1929, the first phase of Neuhausen required loans from American banks for its completion. The second phase to the north was postponed. Over the next 2 decades, at a stage of life that for many architects is their most fruitful and creative, Döllgast's construction activity was limited by circumstance to intermittent new-built houses and churches, and he navigated these turbulent times with a mixture of doggedness and hustle, moulding himself to short-term opportunities with a survivor's instinct, deploying his eloquent drawing skills with consistency of compositional approach and a certain political elasticity. In 1931 to 32, Döllgast worked closely with Hermann Zögel on his Atlantrope project, a crazed but ostensibly peaceful technological fantasy to dam the Straits of Gibraltar and the Bosphorus, lowering the Mediterranean, generating hydroelectric power, reclaiming large areas of land for settlement, and irrigating the Sahara Desert. A work of infrastructure at the continental scale, scaling up from the exactly contemporary damming of the Zuider Zee to take the Mediterranean back to Ice Age sea levels. Zögel's prescriptions for the Atlantrope organisation's headquarters required a certain constructivist dynamism that Döllgast struggled to embrace. That's his sketches on the left, which are accompanied by sort of pleading letters of couldn't Zögel embrace a more conventional symbolism. So Fritz Höger, known for the Chili House in Hamburg, took over this element. However, tasked with the design of a new entrance to the Suez Canal, displaced from Port Said by the lowering of the sea level, Döllgast could reconcile the practical and the symbolic, deploying his singular representational skills, zooming in and out to consider it from afar and close up, thrilling to the dynamism of this node in a web of world trade. He laid out the port, shipyard, goods and passenger railway stations, airport, airship landing strip, seaplane landing spot, in a rectilinear clustering of infrastructures adjusting at the edges to an imagined natural topography. And at the centre of the whole complex are the column-like lock gates and a tall rectilinear tower topped by a glazed lantern, combining echoes of monumental factory chimney with Pharos, the lighthouse of Alexandria, echoing the ancient past to anticipate the technological future, using his persuasive powers at the service of geoengineering, Depression-era public works at a continental scale. From 1940 to 44, he worked as city architect of Thurn in West Prussia, before and afterwards Polish Torun. This wonderful commission, as he called it, later, in the mid-50s, offered him unbridled opportunity to test and develop his urban imagination. He drew prolifically, designing dozens of projects, mostly without consequence. The suppleness of his urbanistic imagination is impressive, citing and organising so many and varied new buildings, adapting and extending existing structures, fitting new institutions to the compact streets around the castle of the Teutonic Knights, entwining them with the landscape beyond the ring of Prussian forts that circles the city. We lead a different, deeper inquiry to reanimate and re-entangle the sheaf of 100 or so drawings of 20 or so projects from his archive, with how this contested city's re-annexation to the Reich actually unfolded. 4 complicated, dynamic years. Can we read in his designs for the sports complex and the harbour the triumphant complacency after the lightning victory? In the numerous institutional buildings, his references to Baltic Gothic types feel heavy-handed, exercises in genre. Is there any trace there, beneath the grand ambition and the surface order of the projects, of the expulsions of the city's Polish and Jewish citizens, and the settlement of ethnic Germans from scattered corners of Eastern Europe? It's perhaps only in the also unbuilt design for a new cemetery that Döllgast's work in Torun arises above the dismal circumstances of its conception. It's a work of rare subtlety, both among his own designs for Torun and alongside the barrack room architecture of the National Socialists. Citing the cemetery beside one of the defensive forts, he traced an avenue of trees perpendicular to the highway, entwined at the entrance with an array of buildings. To the left, the long, low administration and mortuary buildings leading to the tall, narrow chapel that projects into the avenue, with the crematorium behind it. On the right, the walled and turreted garrison cemetery, a tall cylindrical bell tower, and a rectangular walled enclosure, that square. The cluster of simple volumes, part open, part enclosing, connected in loose unitary through supple, clear grammar, the landscape sensibility of small constructions in a mature woodland, place this design in a long tradition. In the walled enclosure, peristyle and massive stone columns measured out an open court with 2 monumental sarcophagi in its centre. Steps down in the opposite corners lead to a pointed arched vault with more sarcophagi. It's an artful assembly of anachronisms that alludes to layers of time, looking backwards to a variety of distant pasts. Its Gothic vault restates the medieval roots of German presence on the Vistula. The subtle conjunction of the simple volumes echo his studies of Roman villas in far-flung corners of the empire, bringing classical poise to his work for the first time. He reinterprets the motifs of classical cemetery design in 19th century Germany, where commemorative monuments were used to shape collective national consciousness. In the reverence of the tomb and the hierarchy of the dead, it comes uncomfortably close to Paul Ludwig Trost's Temple of Honour, to the fallen the beer hall putsch that framed the Königsplatz in Munich. What were his thoughts and motivations? We don't really have much more than the drawings and what we know of conditions. In 1943 to 44, when he was working on this design, the Allied armies were advancing on first two, then three fronts, reaching Caen, Rome and Minsk by the time of the last drawings dated July 1944. High explosive and incendiary bombs were falling with growing intensity on Munich. The bombing started in December 42. Döllgast spent his nights keeping watch from the tower of the Theash. His city and home were in ruins. I've quoted the contemporary report of the Swiss Consul General to give a sense of the background noise. The very sight of it all, this apocalyptic Munich of July the 13th, 1944, no longer turns the thoughts merely to war, but rather to reckless, diabolical madness. And yet still he drew, in a labour of extreme imaginative dissociation. It's impossible to tell what future it anticipates. A deluded conviction in victory, a short-term distraction from the falling bombs, a virtuoso exercise in genre, a comforting vision of dignified burial when those left behind would receive anything but, or a private reflection on the last phase of the German presence in the East, a solemn funeral march for the relentless retreat from the edges of Moscow to the heart of Berlin. In 1945, in a matter of months, he was conscripted to be Volksstern. In a matter of months, the 1,000-year horizon collapsed into a day-to-day struggle for subsistence. A moment referred to in Germany as 0 hour, but an interim condition that lasted many years. The desolation of Munich by high explosive and incendiary bombs was extensive. It took more than 10 years just to remove 5 million cubic metres of rubble. Once again, Döllgast found his niche, immediately earning the trust of the American Occupation Command, who appointed him Dean of the Technische Hochschule of the entire school. Döllgast turned his mind to the challenges of the new situation, ducking and diving. Decimated, frozen, nothing to smoke, ration stamp economy. He patched up the TH's damaged buildings with student labour and scavenged materials. Built a ticket office to get Central Station up and running again for the occupation forces. It would have been round this time that he had a fragment of Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosopher, put up in the courtyard of TH. In large Greek letters, Panta Rei, everything flows or is in flux. A strange, oblique reflection on changeability and constancy, on the durable and the ephemeral, and a stranger reaction still that it caused offence. Once again he drew, seemingly without pause. He designed several carpentry workshops, a warehouse for his in-laws transport company, a number of minuscule houses, an artist's studio, urbanisation plans and apartment blocks, a temporary church, as well as cemeteries, crypts, and a mortuary for his native village. A mixture of the makeshift and memorial, all unbuilt. Unrealised despite their extremely limited constructional means, these designs give visibility to the long in-between period, while the Allied consensus held to deindustrialise Germany in order to demilitarise it, resulting in 4 painful years of stuttering subsistence economy, very little reconstruction work, a period subsequently referred to as the Niemandszeit, literally no man's time like no man's land, in between the National Socialists and the Federal Republic. In this period, under the pressure of scarcity, Döllgast's constructional language shed weight and bombast and embraced an absolute economy of means. His material palette shrank to reclaimed bricks, timber and sheet metal. In these designs, angular, unbalanced monopitches replaced stable double pitches. Finished soffits were omitted to reveal rafters and sheathing. Diagonal braces and gallows brackets bind slender timber posts and beams, and raking masonry buttresses propped broken brick walls. Without the budget for representational displays, construction itself became his communicative means. In the ruins of his own pre-war St. Heinrich parish church, he found a transgressive energy, proposing a monopitch roof that tilts from the light and height of the clerestory windows to the compression and darkness of the chancel arch. Like a Renaissance adoration, the interplay of a makeshift carpentry skeleton with the grandiose of a broken masonry shell expressing the painful, humble birth of something new from the ruins of the old. Already by 1946, he was turning his thoughts to the repair of Munich's institutional buildings. The sheer scale of destruction rendered existing discourses on conservation and repair of very limited usefulness. Döllgast navigated this unprecedented challenge by drawing, grasping reality through intuition rather than words. Faced with the ruptured end pavilion of the Palace of Justice, he sketched wall repairs in coarse brick, abutting the broken line of its stonework, substituting the absent cornice with a deep overhanging roof. He never gave this approach a name. The labels others have given it are not unhelpful, but they aren't his. At that same moment, reflecting on bomb-damaged Milan, Ambrogianoni articulated the same idea of simplified paraphrases, which restate through perspective, alignment, volume, the play of light and shadow, of solid and void, that architectonic sense of the whole that was removed or destroyed. To reflect on the works of these 19 compromised and fruitless years, in another context, Döllgast wrote of the spatial imagination as the ability to dream while awake, the ability to see a promising future in a hopeless present is a professional virtue, it's a necessity. But, taken to extremes, this imagination shades into escapism and complicity. Complicit in intent, if not in deed. This body of work traces Döllgast's imaginative engagement with the rhetoric of his times, making it a rich but challenging resource. A valuable historical record of a creative soul blowing in the wind, responding to the triggers of economic depression, conquest and devastation, with fever dreams of continental infrastructures, ethnic settlement and transcendence through faith. Here, even before his works of reconstruction, his work is date-stamped, oriented and disoriented by the hoped-for future, the longed-for past, the horizon of one day after another. These projects also trace a creative evolution, refining and distilling his attitude to how buildings piece into the urban scale, the memorial role of durable construction, the communicative power of limited language of inherited elements. In other words, in these fruitless years, he rehearsed and refined the approaches that informed all his subsequent work. Döllgast understood better than almost any contemporary Viollet-le-Duc's dictum that the architect is and can only be part of a whole. He starts what others complete or finishes what others have started. Renewing the broken remnants of a series of 19th century monuments in the ring outside the medieval city walls, he responded to the specificities of both their architectural language and their degree of damage. While his colleagues Zeb Ruff, Gustav Zanger and Joseph Wiedemann all built in the medieval heart of the city, Döllgast's interventions were in the 19th century grid to the north of the old city, the Maxvorstadt, including St. Boniface Abbey, the Alte Pinakothek, and an urban intervention at the Marienstrasse, and to the south, the Alter Südfriedhof, the old southern cemetery. These buildings, these urban settings, have a very specific genesis and identity. To compensate the new Bavarian capital's lack of Roman antiquity or imperial pedigree, Munich hadn't really been a significant city until the early 19th century. To compensate this, Augsburg was a Roman foundation, things like that. To compensate this lack of antiquity and pedigree, Ludwig I and his architects had made Munich a kind of museum of architecture, with monumental buildings in the ancient Greek, early Christian, Byzantine, high medieval and Renaissance idioms. Yet beneath these borrowed clothes, these buildings shared the same rigidity of composition, repetition of identical elements, emphasis on direct structural expression, betraying the influence of French rationalism, a side effect of Bavaria's alliance with Napoleon. Klenzer, Ludwig's court architect, worked with Percier Fontaine in Paris. Durand's books were translated and widely read. In Döllgast's hands, by accepting rather than erasing the mark of destruction, these stagey monuments gained the aura of antiquity that their creators had craved. By removing decor and adding without flourish, he emphasised their metronomic rationality. At St. Boniface, fire had left the church roofless, and then a direct hit had severed the apse, crypt and abbey from the southern half of the nave. Döllgast shaped a legible but incomplete new whole from this encounter between the order of the original and the formlessness of the ruin. He transformed the monumental five-aisled basilica into a short, squarish Greek cross, consolidating the church in the remnant shell with only minimal additions. A large new gable wall in sheer reclaimed brick closed up the gaping hole and completed a truncated nave. It steps forward to form in the aisles to enclose the choir. It was sheer and blank in the extreme, the flush outer faces concealing a gradual hollowing out of the interior of the wall. The tall choir was buttressed by two deep piers, here topped with statues and perforated by small square windows in the depth of the roof trusses, but amended for construction into three round arch windows, continuing the rhythms and proportions of the nave clerestory. He re-roofed this compact shell with copper sheet salvaged from the ruins on delicate new carpentry roof structure, transforming 1,900 square metres for 180,000 Deutschmarks, the equivalent of £500,000 today, or £260 a square metre. This retained and reordered torso feels in no way fragmentary, but is focused and intimate, newly vertical. The work of repair and renewal fundamentally transforms the found condition. Döllgast's interventions alter the organisation while retaining the deep structure of the previous whole, working opportunistically to recompose remnant and added parts into a different identity. Around this strong, austere centre, the retained and new corner cells accommodate the font, a raised gallery for the monks, overlooking the altar, a Mary chapel, and in the southeast corner, King Ludwig I's sarcophagus, a final discreet resting place after several more monumental iterations in the plans. The sarcophagus itself was pieced together from broken shards. He teased the retained columns into a mismatched spoliated field, with a new four-square capital, a hybrid of classical foliage and blunt geometric form, on top of the nave columns, and then ravaged capitals and brute plinths on the concrete plinths on the aisle columns. The windows are ornamented only by the names of the apostles. The wall niches for arms and candles also bear Döllgast's distinctive script. Just two anomalies unsettle the overall order. Firstly, the two columns wedged in open gaps in the end wall, which speak of the interrupted fate of the original basilica. Secondly, the delicate new timber roof trusses, syncopated a half bay off the line of the columns and walls, imply a gentle, endless continuation. Döllgast seldom explained his projects at any length. His autobiography is no exception, but he does recount the reburial of King Ludwig I in the company of a couple of labourers and the bishop, in a snowstorm on the building site. He delights in recounting the macabre encounter with a skeleton in full military uniform, a raising of the dead that somehow kind of displaces morbid reflections and commemorative action from presumably a very vivid, fresh memory to the distant past. We don't seem to know much yet about the contemporary reception of Döllgast's works of reconstruction, but in the archive I found the typescript of a 1951 newspaper review in which the renewed St. Boniface found an astute interpreter. What has emerged from the ruins as such a joyless counterfeit is so surprising and authentic that it would send an art historian into a beautiful dream. It begins asserting the superiority of the renewed building over the derivative original. It reads echoes of antiquity and the traces of destruction and metamorphosis and the resonances of the basilica type. The reviewer slips from inferred parallels to blurred identities, writing as if the building is an early Christian transformation of a Roman Hall of Justice, before reverting to the present to conclude. Everything here appears as a fresh start and a new self-consciousness. Are we again at the beginning? Everything is still in a state of becoming. Everything is still possible. What an obligation. By evoking an ancient past through the dismal present, Döllgast's work stirred a memory of hope. Döllgast had unfinished business at St. Boniface. The church is all that remains of his work, and has in fact been altered quite a lot. But as well as grappling with the basilica, he returned again and again to the pastoral spaces and to the relation back to the abbey and to the city. The original St Boniface complex was anomalous, not to say aberrant. A three-part composition of a classical exhibition hall on the south side of the Königsplatz, which is this big one up here, then a figure-of-8 monastery over 2 or 3 stories, very unmonastic, and then this long basilica connected in to it, with the open narthex to Karlstrasse in the south. In the 1949 renewal, he proposed to link the consolidated church back to the abbey with a new ancillary wing in a lean-to along the still-standing west wall. This would have shaped the remnant colonnades into a partial cloister garden, drawing the remains back into a recognisable monastic form. This wing was only partly realised, a very small part, and subsequently destroyed, yet the intent was clear. The courtyard idea reappeared in his projects for further renewal of the abbey in the 60s, first completing the cloister with wings on both sides, and then carving an atrium between the rebuilt church and the street. The consistent thread through 8 alternative versions over 20 years is the exploration of the relation of church to monastery to city. The many iterations illustrate the almost infinite permutations of even a limited vocabulary. They demonstrate Döllgast's restless, open-ended search for the elusive identity of the new whole amid the flux of changing needs and resources. At St Boniface, Döllgast proved the proposition that the most economical structure is not the one that comes off an assembly line, it's the building that's already there. A distinctive and radical interpretation of modernist economy of means to embrace existing capacity. In the projects that followed, he further distilled new additions to a minimum of material, resuming the interest in delicacy and lightness explored in a number of unbuilt church designs in the 20s and 30s, adding steel to his limited palette, enabling a radical attenuation. Steel. Throughout the National Socialist period, steel had been almost exclusively restricted to industrial and military usage. Famously, this bottom left John Hartfield photo collage, at a time of foreign currency shortage, iron ore imports were even prioritised over dairy imports. While designing his heavy masonry structures in occupied Poland, he'd sketched this centre bottom, this radio mast with interest, perhaps a touch of envy. With the division into 2 Germanys, after the end of the Neumann site, industrial production resumed. The heavy caps on steel production were lifted. Steel was finally available for construction. Döllgast's younger friend seems to have been, Setbruf, seems to be the first in their circle to use steel pipes as makeshift columns. In this 1951 apartment building on Theresienstrasse, bottom right, Döllgast was enthusiastic about this new possibility. As he put it in a lecture in 1954, only a ridiculous fogey, an architectural malcontent, would not use every opportunity to build in steel. He revelled in its delicacy. Mannesmann's seamless pipe process, which started in the late 19th century, was invented, had been adapted to make shell and bomb casings and gas canisters, leading to a 5-fold expansion of the firm in the National Socialist period, break-up under the Americans, then reassembly of the conglomerate under the Federal Republic. So Döllgast's use of steel, part of a practical approach to minimise loadings on masonry buildings made unstable by bombing, part of a visual logic of attenuated continuity between present and past, making additions that are congruent with the 19th century monuments, but distant from the National Socialist stark, heavy classicism. But is it possible that by using steel, and above all by exposing it in his repair of the city's monuments, it also speaks of pacification? In the words of the prophet Isaiah, "And he shall judge among the nations and rebuke many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more." Even in the market economy, there are no innocent choices nor actions without resonance. In the explicitly memorial setting, the Alter Friedhof, closed to new burials in 1943, Döllgast enjoyed a relatively free hand, transforming it into a form of memorial park, demolishing and tidying with a surreptitious vigour. The sort of light touch is only partly true. Clearing the remains of broken buildings and reordering the profusion of tombs. His edits largely erase the echoes of Renaissance in the original arcades. And he replaced the formal coherence of the two 19th century colonnades, which bound each half into a tight unity, but which divided the cemetery, divided the whole. So distilling the ruins, or less euphemistically, selectively demolishing them into a sequence of heterogeneous elements, a succession of half-open, half-closed spaces, not unlike his design for the cemetery in Turin. But through this strategy of fragments, subordinating these smaller parts to into a new, looser whole. He reduced the long semicircular arcade of the northern half to the two brick edicules at the two ends, like Roman tombs. He kept just 4 of the original 96 columns and piers from the semicircular arcade. There must have been a couple of hundred in the Campo Santo. He formed a pedimented gable, turning the funeral chapel behind into a lapidarium for remnant sculptures. With this reduction in footprint, he emphasised and celebrated the shift in axis, creating a forecourt with fountains and a basin, and turning Gartner's vaulted transition into a freestanding gateway, opening a lateral public route through the side. In the southern half, he replaced the masonry arcade with its slow rhythm of trusses with a more elemental, oriented porch along the northern edge only, an elongated colonnade with its open side turned to the sun and to the beautiful landscape, to borrow his description of Roman portico villas, from the study that he started in 1913, kept working on and finally published in 1960, and which gathers his thoughts on the interplay of flickering fashions and enduring types in the classical tradition. In contrast, the centre quality of the original, the tilt of the monopitch roof, and the imbalance between walled and open side shift the emphasis outwards to the park-like former burial ground. The columns are like a fine screen between the cyclical growth of the graveyard trees and the frozen time of the stone memorials. And the staccato rhythm of rafters recedes into infinity without any secondary rhythms, aided by fine steel tie rods and steel cross-basting below the sheathing boards. The fine steel posts, like the carelessly slender stalks of Roman wall paintings, are barely the girth of a forearm. They're 5 times slenderer than the slimmest classical order, reviving and perhaps even detoxifying the grand, simple, repetitive order of classical convention. In the lush cemetery, the everyday life of the city is distant, and the suspension of weight and extension into infinity seem to halt or slow time. Cardinal Vendel gave this perceptive interpretation at the opening. How Döllgast repairs the old damaged buildings, how the older architectural orders respected and interpreted, how reducing the components, materials and details to a minimum produces a maximum of the intended effect. How this enables a more comprehensive interpretation of the term economy than the usual one, how necessity becomes a virtue. The Alte Pinakothek is Döllgast's most emblematic work, but it was also the most compromised and contested. So in that sense, it's good to approach it with a bit of a run-up and a sense of who Döllgast was, what he'd done before. As with all the state art galleries, the collection, which stretches from Giotto through Dürer to Rubens, pretty good, had been moved out to storage in underground caves, along with plundered artworks, including the Ghent altarpiece. The building that had been tailor-made to accommodate this collection was heavily damaged, a direct hit. Severed the south facade facing the city, the roof's burnt off, the brick vaults and their elaborate plaster decor collapsed. Many architects advocated demolition and new building to embody new values. Soon after the war, Döllgast became a vocal campaigner on behalf of the ruined art gallery, obstructing bulldozers, exhibiting, this is from 1946, a scheme of humble repair, basically just blocking up the inner wall of the gallery, leaving the gash in the outer wall. He printed a scheme for his students to hand out to voting councillors, closing up the facade with an abstracted paraphrase of the arcaded masonry facade. When the Conservatives didn't react to his stabilisation proposals, he lobbied the Liberals and Socialists and won enough round. His proposal was backed up with cost estimates. 830,000 marks, £3 million of today's values, to roof and stabilise. The same again to fit out. And crucially, I think this is the point he concludes on, 2 years to dry out. This is 1951 already, so it had been open to the elements for 7 years. Yet his works there were far from light touch, recessive or conservationist. The demolitions of surviving fabric were extensive. He replumbed the building circulation, inserting a pair of grand stairs along the south facade, opportunistically using the void broken open by bombs, and carved out routes and voids for new ventilation systems, all at the service of Klentz's remarkable enfilade of top-lit, vaulted galleries. Infilling the bomb crater at the heart of the building with not one but two constructional languages was the unintended outcome of the complex process. The archive drawings trace the evolution of his delicate temporary solution and the opening to the city that made it possible, or that it made possible, sorry, where this, so that here you have the colonnade within the balcony at first floor level, into a glazed curtain wall, abandoned, according to Döllgast, for cost reasons, and then its transformation into a weighty wall of brick, the design that we know. The slender steel posts, 250mm Mannesmann pipes, 19 metres high, sketched out a shallow entrance colonnade facing the city. Its light timber roof structure covering paired monumental stairs in a soaring entrance portico. Briefly opened to the public in 1954, in subsequent works the staircase was enclosed by the rough perforated brick wall and covered by a thin concrete slab, and the entrance, crucially, was shifted to the north side. The idea of the delicate open portico foundered was replaced and inverted. The reappointment in 1953 of the former gallery director Ernst Buchner, dismissed by US occupation forces in 1945 for his role in the theft of the Ghent altarpiece. He was storing it in the caves. Then reappointed under the Federal Republic, this presented Döllgast with a tenacious and opinionated client. An advisory committee of experts scrutinised his proposals and tabled their own alternatives. I think anyone who's done a large public building will be familiar with this force field. The building that opened in 1957 seems to be the outcome of this frequently conflictual relations. His conservationist proposition required cooperation with extreme conservatives. The process was complex, as is often the case with public commissions, and the result is in places contradictory. Nowhere more so than in the adjacency of such different intents on the two sides of the south elevation. The steel columns on the exterior are slender and provisional, as the concrete and brick piers on the interior are massive and durable. The contradictions are those of changing times and priorities, the conflicting aims of different parties, but also those of Döllgast himself, in a mix that's hard to disentangle. He was sufficiently ambivalent about the result to write later that the south facade is not really by me. The tubes were freestanding at one stage. Yet, his work at the Alta Pinakothek transcends the contradictions, the tensions of its making. His repair of the exterior nonchalantly embraces its imperfection. Temporary and permanent, delicacy and weight are fused in tension. The redundancy of column and wall on the south facade speaks with the classical tradition of the original building more richly than either on their own would do. He systematically eliminated elements of intermediate scale, suppressing Klentz's silhouette of statues and prismatic roof lights, replacing them with the new low-pitched roofs and projecting eaves, reinforcing the horizontality of the old box. He takes the rhythms of the classical language and makes them abstract and mechanical without reassuring hierarchy. His sly concrete pediments, added to the projecting side wings, discreetly anchor this shift in emphasis. His coarse brick infills paraphrase missing bits of wall, but also layer the ordering of the facade. The raw masonry inserted into both the facade and the internal entrance sequence, like a visceral interlude in between the delicate stone mouldings of the exterior and the grand, vividly coloured galleries, like flesh and bone beneath the skin. In the galleries, the palette of parquet floors, textile wall coverings, and smooth plastered vaults reinforces the grandeur of the central enfilade, and the intimacy of the north-facing small cabinets. The light is soft and cool, reflects on the polished plaster doorway linings. Its crisp bronze lettering punctuates the journey through. The galleries are superficially much altered from the 1950s, though in volume and detail they are the same. It would need some careful sifting of the archives to distinguish what came from where and whom and what changed when, since, as on the right, coloured textile wall hangings were tested under Döllgast's lead in 1955, and you can see this in the test room, this drape beneath the lay light, and that was actually realised in the central Rubens room initially, but the drape seemed to have gone missing. My impression is that Döllgast shaped the galleries strongly, creating intimate cabinets for smaller works on the north side, reducing their height by inserting a mezzanine office level above, building new rabat vaults with plaster and concrete on a matrix of steel reinforcement. How do you do a vault when the roof's already on, you know? They did it at King's College Chapel, but you do it thin and light, approximating the earlier volumes but with a new lightness. Adding these vaults beneath the roof structure that, in his words, borders on the improbable. Like a butterfly closed its wings and broke. Minimal both in material and in form, leaving different options for the galleries open. They couldn't agree on it at the time, so he just gave it a sort of maximal space through minimal structure. You can see on the top right the remnant of the brick vault that there remained. And part way up, you're actually standing on the ground floor, part way up is then where the first floor goes. So in other words, both outside and in, he used his constructional sense and his logistical nous to advance the project and pick off decisions sequentially from strategy to detail. This combination of political lobbying and logistical chess grandmastery, enabling the patient refinement and sequential judgments, even if he didn't win every battle, this is the full range of skills that an architect needs for this nature of project, for which Döllgast possessed. If you look at one painting when you're there, this is the one. Albrecht Altdorfer's Battle of Issus is one of the foundational works of the collection, drawing multiple overlapping conceptions of the past into the web of the present, rhyming the 4th century BC battle between Alexander and Darius with a contemporary conflict between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Ottomans, resonating with the apocalyptic expectations of the early Reformation, the last battle. Similarly, Döllgast's repairs and additions entwine both actual and remembered layers of time. The original gallery building invokes Bramante and Raphael's palace for the Emperor Pope. Döllgast's remaking carries echoes of late imperial portico villas, ancient Roman basilicas and Baroque palace stairs. The remnants transmit the time of construction in the peace after the Napoleonic Wars. The scars witness the National Socialist catastrophe. The infills speak of the austere years of reconstruction. Expedient new construction is artfully interwoven with inherited classical language games, drawing out a covert interlinking of the before and after, composing history from hope and memory. W.G. Sebald has examined the paucity and inadequacy of contemporary writers' responses to the trauma of wartime destruction. There was a tacit agreement, equally binding on everyone, that the true state of material and moral ruin in which the country found itself was not to be described. He summarises that from the outset, the now legendary and in some respects genuinely admirable reconstruction prohibited any backward view, characterising the rebuilding as tantamount to a second liquidation of the nation's own past history. Architects, by contrast with writers, could not ignore the ruins. They could instruct their clearance in the name of a clean break with the past, as many did. They could crush them and reuse them mixed in concrete, as Gottfried Böhm did at the Fatima-Kirche in Kassel. They could incorporate them in memorial tension to the everyday, as Rudolf Schwarz did at the Götznick in Köln. Döllgast transformations of broken buildings in Munich are simultaneously down to earth and in the grand tradition. They are both expedient and resonant. Indeed, their expedience is self-expressive. They neither hide nor parade their damage, but transform the interrupted parts into new open holes, integrating the dissonance of brute brick and raw steel and the harmonics of exaggerated weight and lightness within deeply literate readings of inherited compositions and rhythms. Döllgast distilled the dramas of brutal destruction and laborious reconstruction, of base material and lofty aspiration, into emblematic, elusive form. In the extreme circumstances of reconstruction, his imaginative dissociation, this dissociation that characterises those fantasy, those unbuilt projects from the 30s and 40s, this dissociation was no longer a form of false consciousness, isolating professional acts from political surrounds, but was actually a natural expression of stunned incomprehension that was shared by almost everyone, simultaneously feeling the epic dimensions of the present and escaping into an imagined past. Both victors and defeated struggled to digest unprecedented destruction, and they, as they did this, intuitively reached for ancient history, debating a Carthaginian peace or invoking the ruins of Troy. As Karl Marx had observed a century before, in unprecedented circumstances, humans anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service, borrowing from them names, battle slogans and costumes in order to present this new scene in world history in time-honoured disguise and borrowed language. Döllgast's skill consisted not in conjuring up the dead of world history, for they'd already been summoned by the original builders and unleashed by random destruction, but in allowing their contradictory voices to speak. Döllgast started his career as an urbanist with the design of Neuhausen. He continued to design at the scale of the city in occupied Toruń. In his work of reconstruction, he continued to think and work as an urbanist, at the scale of individual buildings, but also at the scale of the city. At St. Boniface, he sought to reorient the Abbey Church to the city and to make space for its pastoral life. He made the Altersfriedhof as a memorial park open to the neighbourhood. He looked to reorient the Alte Pinakothek with an external porch, stair and balcony back to the city. Each of these was in part an urban proposition. Contemporary with his work transforming the city's broken monuments, and analogous to them, is Döllgast's Amalienplatz project, a speculative investigation about the possibility of building a tower in the old city of Munich. In an area of particularly extensive destruction in the Maxvorstadt, a short distance to the east of the Alte Pinakothek, he proposed a new urban square in the heart of the 19th century city, defined by a new cluster of mid-rise blocks on two sides, with the other two occupied by existing buildings. An imposing 18-storey masonry tower responding to a step in the street line terminating the long Gabelsberger Strasse. Its height calibrated to the tower of the neo-Gothic St Marcus Church on the opposite corner. He explored the tower's local and wider relations in dozens of street level and skyline perspectives, representing and reviewing the project from every aspect. It echoes and answers the bell towers and spires of the city's churches in a characteristic European domestication of the high-rise, seen as an American import, conceptualising the isolated tower as a discrete topographical signifier, as a new neighbourhood marker. Amalienplatz parallels and expands the urban dimension of Döllgast's monumental transformations, accepting the accidental void and reforming its edges. It scales up from the building to the city, the opportunistic appropriation and destruction. He made clear the coherence of his architectural and urban thinking in a rare aphorism, commending the task of urban renewal to students, stating that in your hands, the past will once again become present and future. Topped with a helipad, the Amalienplatz Tower translates the growing national mood of the mid-1950s of economic and technological self-confidence, once again bending with the times, resuming the future-facing tilt he briefly essayed in the early 1930s, in dialogue with the city's medieval skyline. To conclude, across a wide variety of scales and types of commissions, over the 5 decades between his first and last buildings, Döllgast's work consistently combines clear thinking and careful making in the approach to both the restructuring of what has been and the construction of what is emerging. To borrow Fritz Schumacher's phrases, for the two sides of the architect's work which shouldn't be separated, but for the most of the 20th century were. Yet Döllgast's work misaligned with his most vocal contemporaries, almost as clearly as it fits with the challenges of our present. In a period when buildings were valued as prototypes, as scalable systems, as anticipations of future ways of life, or as instruments of social improvement, there was little in his approach that courted majority opinion or invited critical championing. Indeed, his project stood for a different conception of language, time, and agency. By accepting a language of time-worn conventional elements, without any divine sanction or any overt political purpose, by observing the logic of what has been in what is made, he sacrificed the ability to tailor buildings to the perceived specificities of the present moment, only up to a point, foregoing the promise of substantive change that he knew is largely not in the gift of the architect. But these losses are traded off against the neutral durability of the resulting buildings, and are compensated by the emotive resonance that convention bestows on the elements of construction. Convention brokered congruence between new parts of buildings and cities and inherited ones, allowing for changes over time to be recognised and understood. A dynamic of the invariant and the changeable, of the timeless and the date-stamped, everything flowing. Now that we're faced, in Bruno Latour's words, with the necessity of redoing everything once again, in a strange combination of conservation and innovation that is unprecedented in the short history of modernism, Döllgast's works offer us some clues on what this combination of conservation and innovation looks like, and the processes by which we might arrive at it. Working with an economy of means, with measured and effective material and resource use, in compact repetitive layouts on city edge land. And when faced with the ruins, and using the capacity of existing structures and adding the minimum of new material. Distilling the language of buildings down to a limited vocabulary of elements, a family of walls, columns, windows and roofs, abstracted or attenuated versions of familiar forms, giving new buildings a gently figurative character, a sense that they are castings from a common mould. This distilled simplicity of language without systematization or modularization enabled a response to the constraints of broken inherited structures, in which the work with ruins is part of an ongoing conversation of rule and exception, of repetition and syncopation, of overlapping orders at different scales. Learning from the empirical evidence of historical types interpreting their evolution over time, as well as with the scope for one inherited archetype to morph into another. Embracing repetition both within buildings and at the scale of the city, making unsentimental declensions of basic types, combining them into the collectives of the big city, interweaving with multiple identities and secondary types, encountering the existing city with engaging suppleness. In other words, his work is an unusually subtle exploration of rationality in building. Hence my title, but without perhaps the ism. One strand of a scratchy, irregular thread that links Enlightenment empiricism and geometry, modern norms and postmodern conventions. Döllgast's work shows us the possibilities and limits of an incomplete, open-ended language that is susceptible to reason, but in which rationality is always partial or multiple, in which the needs of even times of crisis and disorientation can be addressed. Thank you.
Piece of scholarship, appropriate for such an extraordinary architect in Döllgast, but also yourself. I think there's a lot of people here, so I think. But I just want to ask. I mean, I suppose how long you've known of Döllgast's work? Far longer than 2.5 years. And I guess I suppose the obvious question I want to ask is both in these last 2.5 years, but also going back over perhaps the last 30 or more years, how has he influenced your work? If that isn't an overly simplistic question.
No,
it's sort of the obvious one.
I mean, like you, I probably first became aware of I wasn't in London when the 9H had their exhibition, but I did see, to learn of it and read the amazing Eric Altenhofer essay, which is one of the best essays about a building. It sort of looks at this turbulent and difficult genesis and tracks it through its evolution. You know, it was Kenneth Clark who said that most people can't look at a painting for longer than it takes to peel a banana. And you get the same sort of feeling with a lot of treatment of buildings. It's like, could you just have a look? Could you just have a look at the drawings and the building? And that's what Altenhofer's essay does, is really a remarkable thing. So, and I suppose that opens up this sort of complicated, I suppose, so it was that, and then also ORs are published, I think, an essay by Winfried Merdinger in the early 2000s, so that's how I became aware of his work. And I suppose there was this thing where, certainly in Astley Castle, of course, then, you know, you're there face to face with a ruin, and you've got this picture, you know, things like John Soane or Gandhi, you know, the image of the Bank of England ruins. It's like, these are romantic fantasies, so it doesn't tell you what, you know, it doesn't give you any clues. So, to learn, you know, actually architects who intervened in ruins, they deal with the weathering, the roof, and the foundations, and, you know, like very simple, basic kind of craft interventions, sort of like Michelangelo at Santa Maria degli Angeli, after Diocletian. So I became aware, I suppose I remembered that thing that, you know, Döllgast had put a roof on the Alta Pinacoteca before repairing it, and that's actually what we proposed at Astley Castle. A very conscious echo of that, not as a reference, but just as a brilliant tactic. And of course, then they got a grant for emergency repairs to stonework, and needed a conservation practitioner and whatever, and so that all went out the window, and we built it, you know, from the ground up. And even actually then, the client, we had generally very good relations with them, you know, one or two sort of difference of judgment or opinion on various things, and actually at the end, they were quite keen on, at one point, on painting, lime washing the rooms, the interiors. and we were kind of resistant, but perhaps with unusual flexibility or suppleness. We didn't say over our dead bodies. We just sort of said, well, let's have a look, maybe make a case-by-case judgment on all of this. And then, of course, by the time actually, that it was time to make that decision, the walls were still at something like 20% humidity, so no paint would adhere to those walls. So the fact that we hadn't roofed it kind of, in a way, bailed us out of that other kind of danger. I suppose so. Yes, I suppose my exposure to Döllgast is maybe sort of 3 or 4 different aspects. It's sort of being dimly aware of it, and then actually with Astley Castle kicking in, getting sort of in deeper, but still not finding much, and doing it from kind of books, and then probably started going to Munich about 10, 12 years ago, and so when I've been back, I've then been to have a look, and then actually I started working, and partly I contacted Max Sternberg because I wanted some sort of guidance and whatever. So that's really been the last sort of 3 years that I've been digging there. All these drawings are online on the TUM archive. Absolutely amazing. So that certainly for long train journeys and evenings and the like, that's sort of easy to get into. I think possibly, it's interesting because I've struggled a lot with this essay, and the deadline is now, it was September, it's now end of June, so I'm going to have to draw a line under it, but I've never got bored. It's like there's so much stuff and there's so much stuff to get into, so it feels like these last couple of years I've just been sort of diving in deep. I don't know where it sort of comes out. We did on the, I suppose there are, I've always liked a low pitch roof, pitched but not aggressively so, and not flat. We had problems on the absolutely terrible waterproofing on the flat roof of the housing in Belgium, which gave us grief for a long time. So you think, well, would it kill you just to sort of tilt that a bit taller? So there's sort of various things, and then integration of ventilation grills. So it's sort of something that almost, I don't know at what point we then sort of trot out to kind of 12 slab blocks in a row. So that's pretty yet to come.
You said a very nice thing. You said design in the sense, design is construction. It takes time, there's a sort of tactical aspect of much of what seems that Döllgast was doing. And you describe, which it's not immediately apparent, but that SB 9H essay goes some way goes a long way basically in that particular room. Anyway.
This idea that design's this sort of thing that happens in an instant. It sort of does, but it happens in many instances. Those are like a sculptor's chippings. You need thousands of those moments to generate a serious, condensed, distilled design for a building.
And they're political kind of negotiations of the same kind as being thoughtful ideas and drawn decisions.
Well, so this thing of the combination of logistics and this idea. Yes, but you see, I managed to find a photograph of Döllgast younger than age 70 or something. He probably looked like he was 70 when he was sort of 30 or something. But and then there's these interviews with him with this sort of Bavarian accent and mumbling away these obscure phrases. And obviously that's him as an old man in his 80s. I think this is a sharp fella, with this sort of take-up campaigning. The whole engagement with the politics of reconstruction to actually salvage the Altpinakothek is a sort of another side of the job that it's difficult to get into, but it's going to be enthusiastic about. But it's kind of fascinating. He wasn't just doing the pretty drawings; he was out on the front line.
He was good at that. Now then, who would like to ask William a question? Should we put some light on it, maybe? Yes.
Firstly, thank you for the lecture, really amazing content. This is quite a complex character in many ways, in like complex times. And I'm interested to know, you giving this lecture is also part of his story, because we're receiving some of his information from you. I'm interested to know what has been your process with dealing with that complication whilst preparing for this essay and lecture, and how do you manage that process, and what have your thoughts been through that?
Thank you. Probably chaotic. I mean, I've been writing for 30 odd years. My first essay was about Tony's work in 94 or 5 or something. And so, after a while, and then you get 2,000 or 3,000 words to do something, and you think, okay, yeah, I can do this. And then you just then you encounter this sort of body work that's a lot more complicated than you thought, So I suppose I sort of started with the art of an architect, and it's kind of interesting, and then, I don't know, and then it sort of broadened out. I was sort of visiting some of his churches and things like that, and he wrote a lot, actually, about sort of 5 or 6 books, but they're all incredibly cryptic. In his autobiography, it's called Journal Retour, and it's a backwards autobiography. So he sort of starts in the present and works back to his childhood. But, he tells you almost nothing about the art of an architect. He tells you about the reburial of King Ludwig. So it's sort of kind of thin picking. I mean, you're sort of having to pick through stuff. Then there's these sort of like 8 versions of St Boniface. You think, well, which one would what do you want to do, why, and so I suppose, I've responded quite critically. I've written 6 full drafts of this essay, and part in me which is just like processing the material, and I'm trying to understand what the buildings are telling me, which I suppose I find you can only almost do by trying to describe them and read the buildings rather than just read about them. And so I suppose I've had various kind of versions of hopefully getting in deeper and deeper, but this thing of, and I suppose the 2 or 3 previous versions of this had the unbuilt projects, and I sort of started one with him, as city architect of Torn, age 52. So I suppose it's this thing of, which I suppose sort of, was it, in rhetorical terms, it's in media res, you start in the middle. You don't start, and so there's been a rhetorical struggle I've had of, how do you make this sort of vivid and immediate rather than like some bloody textbook? Because, I do this as a hobby, if I'm just going to do some textbook thing, then what's the point? So I want to make it sort of urgent and interesting, these unbuilt things, these sort of, and like, this sort of, and it's a very interesting, I've read my partner, Marion, I've read her a number of the drafts, and she sort of very patiently listened, and there's one of them where she said, do you think you should make slightly clearer your disapproval of National Socialism? Because I'd sort of entered into the empathy and not jumping to easy judgments so profoundly that it sort of came across as just like a free pass. And then I suppose the final bit in this sort of journey was actually going back to discussing and trying to talk about what the essence of this work was, and actually thinking, well, it's not just all about the works of reconstruction. They're great, they're fantastic, they're fascinating, and they're very complicated, and they unearth all these things. So, but I suppose this idea of economy of means, and then I came across, actually I was on holiday in India and reading came across these essays by, well, actually no, I asked a friend to send me some essays by Peter Behrens, because there's some stuff I came across, and you sort of I follow various rabbit holes. I found a local history paper about the mayor of Thurn, who was a petty Nazi from Fürth in Bavaria, who's, I think one of his friends had studied under Döllgast and so recommended him, and that was the thing. Döllgast spoke at his denazification trial, of which he had several. So, there's all sorts of wormholes you kind of follow, and then, but I suppose what I'm trying to, so there's challenge to get the information together, just actually find out about some of these damn projects. Then it's what contextualization, interpretation, and trying to bring a bit of professional perspective to this, because I presume the majority of us here are architects, and we know that the authorial intent and references of this and that are kind of the least of the job. It's sort of, you're in this sort of diabolical force field of and you're trying to grapple your way through it. So how I'm trying to tell it a little, and of course there's a danger in that you sort of project onto it, and but I don't think you need to when you read the accounts, or I don't think I'm projecting too much. And that's what I'm trying to do, is to sort of tease out of this kind of complicated material. And I suppose, how many unbuilt schemes have you guys got, Simon? I mean, we've just got hundreds for 20 odd buildings. There must be 100 unbuilt projects or something. So that thing of the unbuilt, and what handbrake that allows you to release, but then what you learn from it, what you flirt with. Those are all things that I think, and I suppose it's interesting, this area. Now every university is under an obligation to, and even people architects teaching in universities have to be doing research. And what is this sort of research? Because is it sort of what, so you can do the technical stuff, you can do the art historical stuff, but how do you actually make the day job of just sort of grappling with, which just consists grappling with areas where there's nothing rational or scientific or logical about it. How do you bring this to some sort of coherence? And I guess that's the ongoing struggle.
That last thing you said, that it's very rare that there is a practitioner of some substance, great substance in your case, who also has the intellectual skills to think about architecture in the way that you have. Somebody like Alan Colquhoun had that. Well, Alan departed from practice and he built very little. And what is very compelling here, and many things that are compelling, what you said, what's very compelling is that it's about continuing to practice. It's about the realization of the knowledge you've accrued into practice. So it seems to me that there's, this is a crazy suggestion, but there's a smaller essay independent of the book on Döllgast, which is a manual to the Döllgast methodology, such as it is, which would be extraordinarily useful now, given the way that schools of architecture, or London, where I teach, has embraced adaptive reuse. And despite the dignity of my colleagues, quite often I see students' work which has no architectural content whatsoever, and lays off any intent of architecture occurring in an adaptive reuse, and that's something I just wrote about for Simon's work. So there is real usable knowledge in practice in what he said, and it's beautiful. But and in the way you talk about it, some of those lessons are obscured. Maybe you don't want them to be lessons, but I think there's an essay which is about how what Döllgast's achievements could lead to an intelligent, rich, adaptive reuse. I mean, a small, you might say, manifesto on it, which would, there's nobody else who could do that with the elegance that you have.
Thank you, that's a very interesting idea. And I suppose there's two things there. One is, it's a dangerous path, the sort of intellectual architect, sort of Alan Cahoon and Rafa Moneo, that
no, but you're not like that. Don't have these ghosts get you.
Yeah.
Monero was kind of obsessed with power and wanted to be head of the GSD and all that stuff, and so he abandoned his work. And his work became a cipher for intelligence, and people that like it are not looking at architecture, they're looking at achievement, in the wrong kind of achievement. And I think what is so proper and dignified about what you're saying is that it's about practice, and you've realised it in your own work in Ashley Castle, or you've realised some of the sensibility.
But then a lot of my struggle with this has been to try and bring the day job to the task rather than just be a kind of a historian. And obviously I don't want to make stuff up or be inaccurate, so it's required a kind of diving in to actually acquire all
well, it doesn't
this
it
stuff,
doesn't
then,
look like wrong history to me. I mean, not that I'm qualified to make such a statement, it doesn't look wrong to me.
No, but I wanted to make it historically literate, but actually for a long time it was just like not dry, but it was just that. And then I suppose what I'm slowly starting to do is try and extract from this the sense of emotional clients, or the cardinal, or even the reviewer, just like this idea that, is it important? It's amazing that you can sort of encounter all this stuff and nobody knows really how. There's very little record of how people reacted when it's like that's the thing we care about. It's like you do the building and.
But that's an incredibly difficult. That's
emotional mood.
The big failure that we suffer. That we can't capture and use productively how people feel about our buildings. They feel lots of different things. I was going to say something, I've forgotten it. Give me a second.
Can I, while you're thinking,
please.
Because I mean, I wanted to make a few observations. We've been talking together over the last few years about writing, and what I feel you're finding a voice through this text, but I also feel that your previous thinking of John Soane is a similar thread that you're finding a language for, which is the sort of human process. I mean, it could be a design process. It's the frailty of difficulty of working with ideas. That it's not. I don't see it as academic. I mean, you need history. You need the kind of facts, let's say. But what you're doing, which I think is special, is making a story that many creative people completely engage with, all that uncertainty and the difficulty and the battles won and lost, the relevance of work that isn't built alongside the work that is, and when the work is built, how it's compromised. that doesn't make it unauthentic or not legitimate, but it's part of a human story of how we all survive. And it's just an observation that I sort of feel. I was reacting to Tony's point that I've always encouraged you in my own discussion with you about the way that you write. It's you're finding a really interesting place between academia and a kind of almost non-fiction sort of biography. I enjoy that little space that you're carving out. The other observation I wanted to make is that you both talked about the 9H essay, and I just wondered if anyone here, I mean, Jonathan and I found Döllgast, I think, through our drug pusher Derek at the AA bookshop, who one day sort of put under our noses, I think in the early 90s, this grey, light grey, floppy, kind of heavy, really badly designed book in German with his drawings, and we sort of shuffled it away and took it away, and this was our first introduction to but we couldn't read, we didn't understand the text, but we were enthralled by the drawings and fascinated by how the drawing explained an idea of construction. Reuse. Our first projects were all about adaptive reuse, like most of our generation, but now it's the sort of wow thing that you talk about. But we were sort of intrigued by how these things this work was stitched together, and I just wanted to sort of I really enjoy the statement you made about this economy of means, that he shed representation in favour of construction, and that when you look at this work, you realise that it's not actually about reuse as a concept, but it's about reuse as a necessity. And this is again why I was wanting to speak straight after Tony, was that this sort of obsession with adaptive reuse, the worry that I have is that it's somehow presented as an end in itself. If I do this, then it's good. And what you see in the work of Döllgast and others is a significant amount of concept and transformation, strategy, detail, that the starting point is the idea of what do I really need to do here? But then there's a huge level of invention that takes place, whether it be how to deal with a column head, or indeed justifying a 26 centimetre steel column in front of a brick wall. And as we all know from that oblique view, that it is so close to the cleanser kind of shadow play, that it's not just about economy. It's still about composition. It still has the essence of what I think most of us still believe architecture is. A set of decisions which are more than just simple answers to problems, but towards a transformation. And I feel that Döllgast has been with many of us for many years, but your sort of opening up of the big story, that you have the patience and the incredible energy to write 6 drafts, by the way, but also to find the text. I remember you explaining when in Munich and looking for the archives and accessing the archives, and I was saying, "Do you read German?" "Oh yeah, kind of enough to understand the letters, read the letters and the text." To me, it's always been incredibly impressive. Of course, I teach right next door to the Pinakothek. I have done for 16 years, and I live with that. I walk past that building every day, and it looks like a compromise project. I mean, all I see are all the pain, all the difficulty. But at the same time, it's the transformation through the double staircase, the reorientation of the building, absolutely completely. It is not a von Klenzer building anymore. So there's it's a radical project, and it should never just be referred to as a reuse project.
Well, as you pointed out, the whole adaptive reuse vocabulary, or that term, comes from the real estate sector. So why are we embracing it? Why are we embracing it? This thing of sort of transformation, or I suppose then you then get someone who's so good at doing it as Döllgast, and then this thing about interpretive reconstruction or whatever, that's not him. What's the Schöpferisches Wiederaufbau? That's Rudolf Astra, the Nazi, the guy who rebuilt Nuremberg Castle and whatever, and then was one of the special advisors who was landed on Döllgast, and probably is sort of behind a number of the moves on that big staircase, which is why it kind of feels as sort of cold as it does. So this whole thing of the attention to words is and the kind of where they come from and how we and entangling them with images. And I suppose what I was starting to get, and this is all stuff, there's a number of things here that have fallen my way through sort of idle internet research at various points. But you know, this thing of like, so the Bavarians, Bavaria, were they Grand Dukes, and then they align with Napoleon, and then they become kings. And you know, that's the thing. And Munich's a little sort of city. I mean, there's not, but you know, Augsburg and what are the other, you know, it's not a Augsburg, Vienna. It's sort of not a kind of major thing. And so it's like they align with the French, and there's also and I suppose the thing I was getting, and I don't know quite how much weight to put on it, and that's, you know, that was like last night's reworking was this thing where.
Is that 6 or 5?
7, but where I suppose, you know, and I was reading Giorgio Grassi about what was it, La Costruzione della Letteratura, which ought to have an English translation, and it's a bit of a struggle, but he's, you know, the whole end is about German rationalism of the interwar period, this whole, you know, Hilbersheimer and Gropius and the like, in which you sort of totally see in this, and so there is this sort of, and there is this sort of thread of, you know, and when you see it, you think, oh God, that's so German, or that's all sort of almost like proto-fascist, and then actually it's French rationalism. You know, all those buildings, you know, the, what was it, 96 columns of the colonnade, or the 200 columns of the Campo Santo. So I think there's a lot of interesting, so I suppose, and the problem is when anything becomes an ism, it just sort of becomes flattened and aggressive and whatever, and we just know that that's not much use to any of us, because there's never that sort of singular quality to things. But it feels to me that there is, you know, in this, there's a lot, that thing of, and because actually, you know, the strange thing was French rationalism, Durand, and even, you know, stuff that preceded him, it's like this idea that you get 10 cathedrals, put them all to scale on the same page. That's sort of 1750s or something for France, and then Durand does it and sort of says, here's the grid you need to do that. So it's sort of, on the one hand, head-bangingly kind of lazy and schematic, and yet also kind of produce some quite beautiful buildings. But it's also empirical. And these people who are going to like interested, it's like, well, here are 6 types of houses, and so that I think there's feels to me, I suppose, and this is probably why I've persisted with this stuff and tried to just sort of burrow through treacle and the difficulties and the, you know, what is it, the politics, to try and come out the other side. You know, it's like, does it, you know, does this sort of, not, I think Fellow Traveller's probably a bit too much, but you know, it's this imaginative complicity with National Socialism. Does this toxify all of it, or just some of it, or, you know, there's a lot of stuff to wade through, but I guess my feeling is there's, as Tony suggests, there's a lot of, I don't know, but is it just about adaptive reuse, or is it even just like, if you need to bash up 1800 homes, which it's like, feels like we do, then there's actually an attitude
I'm not
that
sure
works
about
across
that
scale.
personally. I mean, I think the Neuhausen project, which really relies on heavy repetition, is very much of its time. So the law of Jante, you know, the whole idea of the whole is more important than the individual. You know, these are big cultural ideas which are not always transferable in time. I mean, I'm not sure if it's a helpful model to build housing, but I know it's a.
But I suppose I suppose my point is that Döllgast's relevance transcends the project's transformation. There's an idea there about how you act when you've got a large problem or a big site.
Can I say, I mean, what possibly the appeal of Döllgast to you and to a wider audience is his empiricism, which would be understood by cultivated English mind, which is very different from the continental thinking. You know, that it's adaptive and flexible. And I think that's why this imaginary book that I'm imagining you might write would be so valuable in this time. I think it also, when you speak, it's not simply about the basic architecture of making something that's good looking, it's about the ideas that you discern in it, and that is that kind of recognition that architecture is more than just good looking buildings that are very efficient is lost to students right now, and especially, I mean, I'm going to be challenged by this, but especially given the way that the apprentice system, in my experience at London Met, has made perfectly good students very limited, because their time is limited. And what I sense in the students that I'm teaching now is that their perspective on where they work and the offices in which they work is very, very limited. So a statement that buildings, the transformation, let's say, of buildings, existing buildings into new buildings, is valid and a proper part of architecture. That's one important statement. The other important statement is that within architecture there are cultural ideas, and they're unique to architecture. They're what architecture offers in the way that, say, art offers in its own way. But what we do, in the best of what we do, contains significant cultural ideas. And so those things need to be restated, especially since we have had 30 years of critical theory, which makes nothing possible, and everything defended. And then that's being replaced. And I get some of this at London Met by students saying, well, why are we building? Because the situation is so bad. Why do we even need to think about this? Which is, you can understand from that generation, they would make that point. So I think what is I've seen in offer in your work is a possible, useful and healing statement for a lot of young generation of architecture students. So, I mean, if something could come from it, I think it would be incredibly valuable.
Well, William, thank you very much. There's obviously a kind of mirroring of Döllgast in your process with your 6 or 7 drafts. You're fully embracing his methods. But I guess on a serious note, what you, I think much of this conversation has been about is this, as you said, that not acting as a historian or not acting purely as an academic, but actually, you write and you speak as one who thinks about building and making. And in the process of doing that, you induce that in us. We all think about these things afresh.